Our opening words are by Reverend Gretchen Haley. We are keepers of hope, holders of memory, storytellers and song weavers pulling on this thread of truth. We are here to do the work of hope, remembering the past, remembering ourselves, imagining our most possible future for this life that teeters too often on the edge of forgetting that we belong to each other. Bring all you are, every shadow and every light, every hope, every fear, for this radiant hour. Come, let us be hope for each other. Come, let us worship together.
These words by Paul Sprecher. We light this chalice in memory of the courage of those who have struggled for freedom, the persistence of those who've struggled for justice, and the love of those who've built beloved communities to carry on the light of hope.
So today is a special service. Today we are diving into our history to hear the story of Reverend Jeffrey Campbell and his sister Marguerite Campbell. Some of you may have already read a bit about Jeffrey and Marguerite from the display in our gallery, and if you haven't seen it, it's fantastic, so take a look. After hearing a little bit about Jeffrey and Marguerite at an event last spring, Roy Goodman, Harry Perkiser, and Tristan Husby, who are up here with me today, formed the Jeffrey Campbell Study Group. For almost a year now, this group has been researching the Campbells, and they will be helping me to tell their story today. Jeffrey and Marguerite grew up in Nashua in the early 20th century and attended the Nashua Universalist Church, one of the two churches that came together to form this church. They attended with their mother, Lillian Campbell. As adults, Jeffrey became a Universalist and then a Unitarian Universalist minister, and Marguerite worked for the Unitarian Universalist Association for many years. Despite their commitment to our faith, both Jeffrey and Marguerite faced racism and discrimination from Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists, and the institutions of our faith throughout their lives because they were Black. The stories we will tell today will not all be easy to hear. We like to think that our spiritual ancestors have always been on the right side of history. Jeffrey and Marguerite's stories make it clear that this has not been the case. However, it's important to hear and acknowledge these difficult stories for many reasons. To lift up the voices of those who too often get ignored in our society, to remember our past so that we can do better in the future, to come to terms with the actions of our spiritual ancestors, and to figure out how we can honor the legacy of individuals who have not gotten the recognition they deserved in the past. And so I invite you to hear these stories today with an open mind and open heart, that we might learn from them and work together to make our faith the shining light in the world we want it to be.
Shining light,
so I'm not Sadie.
Neither am I. Thought I'd point that out.
But I'm also not on. Now I'm on. Ooh. I'm still not Sadie though. But we do have a Wonder Box. And I'm so excited about today's Wonder Box. I wonder what's inside. You see, Harry brought in a special box today, and I think what's inside is going to be beautiful.
Well, I certainly was very excited to bring this morning to show you. And unfortunately, coming in from the parking lot, I tripped and fell, and well,
it is icy.
It's broken.
Oh.
Can we try to fix it?
Wait, I didn't break it.
Well, I know, but can you help me fix it anyway?
You mean help you fix it even though I didn't break it? I just need you to understand, Harry, that I'm a good person, right? I don't go around breaking pots.
Stipulated, but it's important to me that we figure out how to fix this bowl because it means a lot to me.
That makes sense, I guess. So what do you think? Do you think we should fix this pot? Yeah, you do. Oh,
Okay then, do you have any ideas about how we could fix it?
yeah, what do you think? Glue it together. We could glue it together. Re-pottery it together.
Ooh.
On a pottery machine. What else? Way back there. Oh, heat it up and make it melt and then try to stick it together.
Not bad, not
Wow.
bad.
These people have
Well,
good ideas, Harry.
But I have an idea too. It's called kintsugi.
Oh, what's kintsugi?
I'm glad you asked. As he thumbed along in his script, kintsugi is the ancient Japanese art of repairing broken pottery and ceramics. Gold is used to highlight the beauty of the imperfections that remain when a broken item has been repaired.
Oh,
I think we have a
kind of like that?
picture of one up there, yes.
Huh. So what I'm learning is that the point of kintsugi isn't to hide the broken parts, right?
That's right. The gold is used to remind the user over and over that something that was once broken is whole again, and it has a different beauty.
In a way, that's kind of what happens when other things break too, isn't it?
What kinds of things?
Well, like relationships, friendships. Sometimes we hurt each other's feelings, and it's like the thread between two or more people breaks. But as Unitarian Universalists, we don't ignore that, right? We try to rebuild relationships so that it's stronger, actually, than it was before.
I agree. The work of healing is all our jobs, no matter how big or small we are. And when we repair our mistakes with love and with our covenant, we remember that our relationships are more beautiful once we have acknowledged hurt, asked for forgiveness, corrected our mistakes, and made a sacred promise to do better in the future.
So I guess that means I could help you fix the bowl, even if I didn't break it.
I'm so relieved.
So when our children go to their faith formation classes, we adults will be thinking about a story of brokenness from our past, so that our faith and our congregations can work to repair that brokenness with beauty and love, just like Harry and I could repair this broken pot, maybe with gold.
Jeffrey Worthington Campbell was born in Boston on March 1st, 1910. His father, Jeffrey Sr., was black and made his living, according to the Registry of Births, as a commercial traveler. Jeffrey's mother, Lillian, was white, Her marriage to Jeffrey Sr. caused a significant rift in her relationship with much of her family. Jeffrey's sister, Marguerite, was born in 1916. Jeffrey Sr. was killed in a racially motivated attack when Jeffrey was 12. The family moved to Nashua around 1919. Young Jeffrey, after doing some church shopping with his mother and sister, decided to attend the local Universalist church. In an interview with Reverend Mark Morrison Reed, conducted when Jeffrey was at the end of his career, recounts the story as follows, quote, "When I was 9 years old, my mother told me that I could go to any Sunday school of my choice. And I tried the Methodists and the Baptists, and the refreshments weren't there. The Congregationalists provided seconds. The Universalists put it down and let me help myself. So when, 15 years later, the Committee on Ordination asked me why I had selected that particular denomination, there was nothing to do but tell them the truth. And they still let me in." End quote. Also, you should imagine that in an English accent, because Jeffrey had traveled to England and lived there for 12 years and came back with an English accent. Jeffrey, Marguerite, and Lillian became active members of the Universalist Church from the time Jeffrey made this important choice. Almost from the beginning, Jeffrey remembers suspicious whispers about him and his sisters as the only black children at that church. In his essay, Personality, Not Pigmentation, Jeffrey writes of his early experience of prejudice at the Nashua Universalist Church. Quote, "By the time I was 12 years of age, the paradox between intention and action of universalism was shaking that little church. Self-satisfied, middle-class people that they were, they had nevertheless been attracted by a faith which preached the fatherhood of God and the universal brotherhood of man. That message had struck sufficiently deep for them to realize that they could not preach or accept that belief while excluding the only youngster of mixed parentage in the Anglo-African sense in the neighborhood. With each stage of my development, the paradox grew sharper. Should I take a role in this or that pageant? What would the conference say if I were to represent the church? Should I be asked to teach a class? Would it be safe to hold box socials where anyone's daughter might ... The ellipses are Campbell's own. Despite this, the Campbells remained active in the church, and in 1923, Jeffrey officially joined as a member.
After high school, Jeffrey Campbell was accepted at the theological school at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York. He was the first African American to enter this school, and his presence immediately presented a challenge and a soul-searching within the Universalist denomination. Though the Dean of St. Lawrence, John Murray Atwood, recognized Jeffrey's gifts and believed he should be given a chance, denominational officials were less sure it was worthwhile to support Jeffrey in his path to the ministry. In his essay, Personality, Not Pigmentation, Jeffrey wrote of his experience with the committee that granted fellowship as a minister. Quote, "I shall never forget that committee of fellowship, which examined me for ordination. 30 minutes on my theology and 4 hours on my politics and racial attitudes. Finally, the committee voted ordination. It did so with more travail of spirit. They wanted their church to be the kind of institution which could unite its theory with its practice. Inwardly, they knew it was not, nor within the limits of their imagination could they see it becoming that. Failure to ordain me would have been an even more flagrant confession of that same failure.
Ordination and search for settlement was also a fraught path for Jeffrey. When the Winthrop, New York Universalist Church wrote to the National Universalist Office asking about whether or not they should ordain Jeffrey, the response from the superintendent, Roger Etz, was less than enthusiastic. He said, "Personally, I have no color prejudice, and theoretically there should not be in any of our churches. Practically speaking, however, there is bound to be, and I do not anticipate any success in settling him as a minister. I hardly know what to advise in regard to his ordination. Of course, if it was carried through, he would expect us to find him a church, and frankly, I don't know where he can be located. My own feeling is that this problem ought to have been faced squarely by the school long ago, and that it was a mistake to let him feel he could finish his course and then secure a church."
Roger Etz was not far off in his predictions for Jeffrey Campbell's ministry. After graduating in 1933 and being ordained as a Universalist minister in 1935, Jeffrey was unable to find a permanent position in ministry. His race overshadowed all other considerations of his resume, despite supportive and glowing recommendations from the people who knew him. In 1938, the Unitarian denomination granted Campbell fellowship on the basis of his Universalist credentials, but this acceptance did not lead to any permanent ministerial positions either. At times, Jeffrey was even attacked by other Universalists for his desire to serve as a Universalist minister. John van Skyke, editor of the Universalist publication The Christian Leader, wrote in an editorial in 1940 that it is fine, quote, "if a young colored man desires to enter a white theological school to get an education and has as his ideal the service of his race. If, however, he despises his race, wants to have nothing to do with it, insists that he intends to join the white race, serve white churches, marry a white girl, we should tell him to go elsewhere." Though he did not mention Jeffrey by name, the reference was clear.
During the mid-1930s, Jeffrey Campbell supported himself with part-time and temporary leadership positions, in the process becoming an activist and a leader in the Universalist youth ministry. In 1939, Campbell won a fellowship to study theology in England from the peace organization Fellowship of Reconciliation. Shortly after Campbell arrived in England, World War II began. During the war, Campbell declared himself as a conscientious objector and supported himself after his fellowship expired by teaching returning soldiers and their families. After his return to the United States in 1951, Jeffrey Campbell took a position teaching English literature at the Putney School in Vermont. He remained on the faculty there for the rest of his life, while also trying repeatedly to gain a full-time position as a UU minister. He never succeeded. He did serve as a part-time minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Amherst, Massachusetts, and then as an on-call minister for the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brattleboro, Vermont, a position for which he was not paid.
Jeffrey was not the only Campbell to suffer from racial prejudice and discrimination at the hands of Universalists and Unitarian Universalists. His sister, Marguerite, encountered similar resistance. In a letter to us from one of Jeffrey's daughter. Jocelyn Campbell referred to the woman she knew as her Aunt Rita as, quote, the saddest woman I had ever known, end quote. In 1939, Jeffrey officiated the wedding of Marguerite and Francis Davis, a white man who studied theology at St. Lawrence University with Jeffrey. On August 12, 1939, the editor of the Christian Leader, John Van Skyke, published an editorial entitled Idealism and Realism in Mixed Marriages, in which he condemned mixed marriages because of the hardship they cause on the children. The editorial was a thinly veiled attack on the Davis-Campbell wedding and Jeffrey Campbell's role as an officiant. In the editorial, he wrote, quote, would it be right to withhold a Universalist pulpit from a man who contracted a marriage of this kind? It would be right, because the man cannot do the work. It would not be right, as it would not be right to call a man who could not read, or could not enunciate, or had met with an accident that had imposed a handicap that could not be overcome, end quote. In a letter to the Christian Leader in 1942, John Murray Atwood, Dean of St. Lawrence University, noted that the newly ordained Reverend Francis Davis, Marguerite's husband, still had no ministry. Because of Davis's skills and ability, in addition to the shortage of credentialed Universalist ministers, Atwood concluded this could only be because of the racism directed at Davis's wife, Marguerite. Indeed, Davis never found a ministry and ultimately became a social worker instead. Like her brother, Marguerite was dedicated to the Universalist denomination, even though its leadership consistently rejected her and her service because of her race. In the 1950s, Marguerite began work with the Universalist Christian Association and continued to serve the denomination after the merger at the newly formed Unitarian Universalist Association. Marguerite only retired from this work in the 1980s. There is not as much documentation about Marguerite's life as there is about Jeffrey's, so we can only imagine what it would have been like for her to serve a denomination that continually refused to support both her brother and her husband in their ministry.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.
Throughout his life, Jeffrey Campbell did not hesitate to name the racism and discrimination he experienced at the hands of Universalists and Unitarian Universalists, perhaps most publicly in his 1940 article for the Christian Leader entitled Personality, Not Pigmentation. In that article, Jeffrey writes of the many instances of, quote, the paradox between intent and action, unquote, that he experienced in the Universalist denomination. On the one hand, here was a faith that spoke of a belief in the universal brotherhood of man. On the other hand, their actions said something different altogether. As Jeffrey put in his article, quote, it is the refusal of men to act on the reality of their common brotherhood which has produced the hell in which we blindly struggle today.
Throughout the article, Jeffrey writes not only of his disappointment with Universalism to live up to its ideals, but also his unwavering faith that it was a denomination worth supporting nonetheless. He described Universalists as, quote, a band of men and women who, in the increasing chaos, can see a new heaven and a new earth. And it is clear that he writes this article because he truly believes Universalism can and should become the faith it declares itself to be. In letters to denominational officials later in his life, Jeffrey was also not shy about sharing his many negative experiences, both while seeking employment and in his relationship with a larger denomination. At the same time that the Unitarian Universalists were becoming deeply involved in the civil rights movement, Jeffrey continued to struggle to find a full-time position.
Though Jeffrey Campbell claims he became a Universalist because of the quantity of refreshments at Sunday school, it's clear from his story that he stayed in this faith and dedicated his life to its service because he truly believed in the vision of universal love. Near the end of his life, after all that he had experienced, he wrote, I would still undertake the call had I my life to relive. His and Marguerite's perseverance in this faith, despite all the times Universalists and Unitarian Universalists failed to live up to their ideals, was matched only by the perseverance of the racism and white supremacy that was working against them. Jeffrey and Marguerite are not the only Black Unitarian Universalists who have seen what our faith could be and seen it fail time and time again to live up to that vision. This is a common story, more common than we would like to admit. One of the reasons that Unitarian Universalists across the country right now are working to confront the racism and white supremacy in our midst is because we know this legacy, and because we know that we can and should do better. Like that broken pot in the story that Harry and I shared, we may not have been directly involved in these wrongs from our past, but we are still responsible for doing what we can to put that pot back together, to own our past and to learn from it. We inherit the legacies of our spiritual ancestors, both the good and the bad. We cannot change the past, but we can work to create a better future. We can still honor those from our past whose legacies have been forgotten. Throughout his time searching for a congregation and waiting for his faith to live out its ideals, Jeffrey was told consistently to be patient a little longer. This echoes the rhetoric often used against Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was told to wait for a better time. We cannot wait any longer to truly affirm and promote the inherent worth of every person. We cannot ask people to wait for justice while we waste our time making excuses for ourselves or for our ancestors. Now, you may be wondering at this point, what can we do? What can we do now to begin to right these wrongs? What does this story from our history call us to do now? And you'll be glad to hear I have 3 things that we can do to honor the legacies of Reverend Jeffrey Campbell and Marguerite Campbell. First, we can honor the Campbells by telling their story. We have begun to do this today, but today can't be the only day that we speak about Jeffrey and Marguerite. Just as if we're truly going to honor folks from Black history, February can't be the only month that we speak about Black history. Jeffrey and Marguerite are as much a part of our congregation's history as Daniel Abbott, Anna Stearns, and Don Rowley. Second, we can honor the Campbells by continuing our work to dismantle white supremacy in our faith, in our congregation, and in society at large. Jeffrey saw what our faith could be if we truly lived our ideals. Let us honor him by working to make it so. And finally, we want to honor Jeffrey and Marguerite in a very concrete way as well. As our study group did their research over the past year, one of the things they discovered is that Jeffrey and Marguerite are buried together in an unmarked grave in Nashua's Edgewood Cemetery. We have received the blessing of Jeffrey's 2 adult daughters to create and install a marker for their grave that properly honors their service to our faith and to our world. And we've started a Faithify campaign just this week to raise funds for that marker. We plan to have a ceremony in the fall to formally install the gravestone. This marker celebrating Jeffrey and Marguerite will not excuse the past racism of our faith, nor will it correct this record. However, this marker will bring to the center Black history that our faith has so far been content to leave in the history books. So we invite you to donate to this campaign and to join us in the fall to remember these spiritual ancestors again. In his chapter on Jeffrey and Marguerite, John Hurley writes, "Universalism, Unitarianism, and Unitarian Universalism turned their backs on Jeffrey Worthington Campbell, never recognizing the gifts that he could have brought to their ministry. And despite that failure of courage and imagination on the part of church leaders, Campbell never descended into bitterness and never regretted his call to the ministry. We are left to imagine," says John Hurley, "what Unitarian Universalism would be today had Francis Davis, Marguerite Campbell Davis, and Jeffrey Campbell not been barred from the service they sought to give." We are left to imagine and to do what we can to honor Jeffrey and Marguerite now. We are left to imagine and to work to ensure that the future of our faith is free from the racism and white supremacy that so many Black Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists have faced. We are left to imagine and to make sure that we do better next time. In that spirit, I invite you to join me in our closing hymn, There Is More Love Somewhere. This is a hymn of longing, but also of possibility. Please rise in body or spirit.